Welcome to the Free Birth Podcast, a supportive space for people who are learning, exploring, and celebrating their autonomous choices in childbirth. Together, we'll unpack truths, share personal stories, and claim our ability to birth freely and intuitively. Here's your host, Emily Saldea.
On this episode, we have an interview with author and free birther Laura Shanley. After birthing all 5 of her children in her home with no medical assistance, she went on to write the book on unassisted childbirth. We get into her personal story, from having Child Protective Services take away her firstborn for 5 days, to an unexpected footling breech delivery, to birthing completely alone as a personal challenge. Laura really has done it all. We talk about loss, birth politics, and painless birth. Her book has inspired many to claim their birthing power and say no to routine care. I want to hear from you. If you have a question, comment, story to share, or an episode idea, find me on freebirthsociety.com and send me a message. Also, reviews on iTunes are awesome. It helps spread the podcast to more listeners. Let's build and connect this community. So, in the first half of your book, that's really focused on the information-heavy parts. It was really interesting for me as a birth keeper to read because I noticed more than any birth book I've ever read, it triggered so much secondary trauma that I have of every experience that, you were bringing up, every intervention, and really illuminating the truth behind the intentions of these interventions. I mean, I was pretty blown away. I was crying and really being called to reprocess a lot of stuff that I have seen. And I was grateful for that because as a birth worker, I'm only recently starting to come to terms with how much abuse I have really witnessed. Mm-hmm. Which is something that I don't think doulas talk or moms talk enough about.
Right. Years ago, I met with a group of women. For about a year, we met once a month, and it was primarily doulas. And then there were a couple of us in there that were having unassisted births. But it just amazed me every month. It was just sort of this, people were pouring out their hearts and saying, okay, I went to another birth and this is what they did, this is, and most of these women working in hospitals because the midwives around here weren't really, or the people that were hiring midwives weren't really looking for a doula. They felt like the midwife was sort of providing that service. And so these were doulas who were working in hospitals, and it was just so hard for them to witness all the interventions that were happening. And I even looked into being a doula at one point, and I felt like if I would need to go to hospitals in order to work, I just don't think I could do it. I just think it would be very hard for me to sit there and watch a woman being interfered with continually.
Yeah. And even a step beyond being interfered with, but actually being bullied and coerced and lied to and, stuff forced upon her. As it can get pretty bad.
Right.
So
I went to a birth in a hospital
recently.
I've only been to 2 births in my life other than my own. And one was my daughter, and she gave birth like in a birth center with a midwife, and they pretty much left her alone. And then the other one was in a hospital last year, and she was bound and determined to do it naturally. And eventually the nurses are coming in, sweetie, it really is better for you and your baby if you have the epidural, and it really is, you'll be able to relax. And then, she had the epidural, and then, can I get in the position I want? No, I'm sorry, sweetie, because now your legs can't support you. And so you're going to have to be on your back. So
Yeah.
it was still, a miracle, like witnessing a baby being born. It was still exciting and all, but
Of course.
boy,
I
yeah.
wish that they said the
Right.
truth, which is, sweetie, you would be so much easier for us to manage on this
Right.
on this busy floor if you were numb and immobile. And
Right.
also, we are programmed to believe that you need to be saved and that birth is suffering, and so please let us save you. What if they use that language?
Right.
I mean, that's how I hear it. But
yeah. Right.
Was that a family member or a friend?
No, it was a friend. It was a woman that was sort of I knew her somewhat, and this was her daughter, and I had actually met them in Abraham Hicks meetup, in an Abraham Hicks meetup group, and she read my book, but just didn't really feel confident about doing it unassisted, and just felt like she wanted me there, and so I said I would do it, and so it was, in the end, she didn't have a C-section. So, yay, she didn't have a C-section.
Isn't that the bar? Yeah, that's the bar that we're at. Yeah, seriously. Yeah. So let's back up a little bit. Okay. Obviously, I read your book and absolutely loved it. And it's in the free birth community, it's definitely one of the core, pillars of inspiration and information. And but I was wondering, even before we get into why you wrote the book, you touch on why you chose free birth initially, but I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit of, way back when you and your partner, decide to opt out. Can you talk about how you really originally made a pretty radical decision?
Well, for one, I was, as I wrote in the book, I was just never really a fan of doctors. My father was a doctor, and I had been surrounded by doctors growing up. My mother did medical research. My sister was a labor and delivery nurse, and there was just something about it that I never found doctors to be a comfort to me. Periodically I would get strep throat, so I'd go in for penicillin shots and, of course, vaccines. I just found it all very traumatic. And I never really was sick. I mean, other than getting strep throat, I wasn't the type of person that I was really in pain and then a doctor made me feel better. For me, a doctor always kind of made me feel worse, with the shots. And I feel like even with the strep throat, I think it would have gone away on its own. But because my kids had sore throats over the years, I never took them in to a doctor. They never had a penicillin shot, and it went away, So I always sort of had, and I had some traumatic experiences with a pediatrician. And so I feel like I was doctors were just not a comfort to me. And I always felt, although, yes, I do believe that their doctors can do some good, and I believe in, especially in emergency medicine, it's wonderful. But I always was like, there was a certain arrogance that I saw in doctors that always bothered me. I always was sort of one to question authority, and I just really didn't like feeling like they were the ones who were knowledgeable and I was the idiot, But so although I did go occasionally, I think during my adolescence, maybe, OBGYN just for birth control, that kind of thing. But but I think what really got me thinking about not having a doctor is when I really started getting into spirituality and discovered that there really is something beyond the physical, that there is a larger consciousness. And when I started to get a sense of that, it was like seeing someone in a white coat. It was like they were it was almost like, I loved my dad, but I remember going to see him. Because I was estranged from my parents for years. And when I finally did go see him at his office, and he was wearing a white coat, and it was almost like a Halloween costume, like the stethoscope, the white coat. It was just like, no, there's something that we can tap into within ourselves that is so much greater than this, that is so much more knowledgeable than this. And that knowledge that I was starting to become aware of, the knowledge that doctors have, I think just pales in comparison. I mean, I had really started to get a sense of my true power, and I'd started to have things happen to me that were showing me the power of my thoughts and my feelings. And that was just so powerful to me that I felt like to go into someone and have them say, okay, now I'm the authority and you're going to listen to me. I just thought, no, that doesn't feel right at all. And so I think it was, we had been studying Grantley Dick Reed, Childbirth Without Fear, which made total sense to me. I really liked how Grantley Dick Reed explained the fight-flight response, and I just thought, yes, this absolutely makes sense. This shouldn't be the most painful, horrible ordeal a woman ever goes through. It makes much more sense that this has been designed beautifully, but somehow things are getting messed up. And I don't think it's because of evolution that we're walking upright when we shouldn't, or the pelvis has narrowed. I don't think it's this series of accidents. I think that there is a larger consciousness that has designed our bodies beautifully. And if we can understand how to relax and trust that consciousness, the same consciousness that is growing the egg and the sperm into a human being, I mean, I'm so amazed by that consciousness. And I feel like, why wouldn't that being know how to complete the process? So when I got pregnant, and we were originally actually thinking about having a midwife, and then we really started to think about how we are going to have to teach that midwife everything that we are learning now about how the mind affects the body, and we knew that probably midwives were already leaning in this direction, but is a midwife going to say, you know what, you have the knowledge within you. What do you want to do right now? What are you feeling like? And there are some midwives that do that, but ultimately the midwife has to choose. Do I answer to the state? Do I answer to the woman? Or even, do I answer to the state? Do I answer to myself? Because she may be getting those same promptings that the woman is getting. Like, you know what? Everything's fine. So what if your water's been broken for more than 12 hours or whatever? So we just felt like, yeah, we're going to have to teach the midwife about what we're learning. Why not just do it ourselves? And so it was really our belief in the power of our own minds. And we felt like, if I can envision the kind of birth that I want, I can create that. So we just decided not to look for a midwife. And I went in for a pregnancy test, and that was it. I never went back with any of my pregnancies.
And previous to this decision, what had been yours and your partner's exposure to birth? I mean, did you know anybody who had normal physiological births? Did you have a positive birth?
What I knew was basically, my mother had talked to me from an early age about birth. She had explained it to me, and the thing that stood out in my mind was the episiotomy. It was, she said, and then they make a little cut, and I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah.
And at what I thought as a child, and I remember she was trying to speak about it in a calm way, but I was just horrified, and I remember thinking, I'm just not going to have children. And I really was not one to fantasize about having children. Growing up, I thought about a career. I thought of myself as, a liberated woman, and I just didn't I really didn't think much about motherhood at all. And then I remember reading Childbirth Without Fear, and I remember the maternal feelings just surfacing, like suddenly they were there. And I think the fear had just blocked those feelings. And so as soon as I was able to eliminate a little bit of that fear, there were those feelings like, oh my God, I want to have a baby. And, I really didn't think about this until, the night that I met my husband, and he gave me a copy of Childbirth Without Fear. Like, he was reading this book.
That's so cool.
He was interested in birth trauma. And so he had come across this book, and he was like, birth doesn't have to be traumatic. And he felt that birth trauma sort of sets you up you get this idea in your head that life is difficult and traumatic. And so it sort of sets the tone for future experiences. So if you can have a trauma-free birth, that you're not going to have all the anxiety and the problems that so many of us have, that, so let's figure out then how can we not have a traumatic birth?
Yeah, one of the things you pointed out in the beginning half of the book was making that connection between babies who are born on drugs, i.e. epidural, morphine, fentanyl, whatever it is, that that connection between that and drug addiction later in life. And I thought that really blew me away, because it's so obvious, but it's something that, doesn't really get talked about, because epidurals are painted as this totally get out of pain free card and totally harmless and doesn't affect anything. But the reality is that imprinting that you discuss of a baby receiving the implicit, memory, the message that when we as a team get stressed out, we turn to narcotics, and we're going to literally numb the pain, literally.
Right.
And then we're surprised that we have this culture of drug addiction and pharmaceutical, addiction and numbing the pain, is just a fascinating correlation that needs to get more conversation.
Right.
So you're pregnant, you decide to go unassisted. It doesn't sound like you had the most support from your family or community, but you guys did it anyway. And will you talk to me a little bit about your births? I'd love to hear, an overview of them. As I remember it was the first one was the two of you, and then the second one was a unexpected breech.
Right. Yes. So the first one was a face first, and I didn't even really think about that. When I had told someone about my first birth and I said I felt his face at my perineum, and somebody said, "Oh, he was a face presentation," and I thought, "Oh yeah, I guess I hadn't really thought about that."
Yeah.
And even at the time, I wasn't thinking, "Oh, I shouldn't be feeling a face." It just didn't. I mean, I had read Spiritual Midwifery. I had read Childbirth Without Fear, but I just wasn't thinking that babies are technically not supposed to be born face first. But I went into labor with him about 3 p.m, and I just sort of went about my life. And we had a few friends that wanted to be there. We had a filmmaker who had been interviewing us, and he worked at the university, and he wanted to be there, so we called him. And then another friend of ours was staying with us, and a male, and so I think he was sleeping outside in his truck. And this was 19.
Yeah, I was just gonna say hippies.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we were hippies. This was 1978.
Yeah.
And then my former boyfriend and his new boyfriend had wanted to be there. So
it was you and all men, right?
It was me and 5 men?
That's amazing.
Let's see, the filmmaker, my boyfriend, husband, our friend, and my husband. Yeah, so me and 5 men.
How funny.
And those were the people that wanted to be there. Yeah. So we just had everybody come over, and it was probably around midnight by the time, when everybody got there, I think. And we all just were kind of hanging out. Everybody was smoking pot, and I decided, I was in the bathroom. I was sitting on the toilet, and everybody's kind of in there with me, and I decide that, because that's the most comfortable place for me to be.
Sure.
And so I decide, okay, I'm going to take 1 hit of pot, because I hadn't been smoking. I had smoked during my pregnancy somewhat, and I decided I would take 1 hit during my labor, and I took 1 hit, and as I breathed it out, he just started coming out.
Wow.
So
do you feel like it helped?
Yeah, I do, and I never did it again in any of my other births. But I do feel like, that's how I felt at the time. And it's a natural substance, and I'm pro marijuana. So,
well, and I mean, also, like, give me a break to anyone who judges that, because the first thing they offer you at the hospital is morphine.
right.
It's like, don't do anything, and then when you show up, we're gonna literally give you hardcore narcotics.
Right.
So absolutely. And I see wine a lot at home births as well, and especially towards the end of the labor. I mean, it's like anything that's gonna help you drop down and let it happen is gonna be great.
Right. So when I breathed it out, and I just felt, and I think my water broke while I was on the toilet. And then it was like right after that, and I reached down after I breathed it out, and I felt his face. And I remember a friend telling me, don't give birth on the toilet, because, she thought, okay, the baby could fall in the toilet, which it can happen. But so that was my motivation for getting off of the toilet. And so I walked over to the bed, but I didn't tell anybody that the baby was coming. And so the filmmaker backed up and turned off the camera to let me by. And so then I got onto the bed, and I was on my hands and knees. I was about to turn over, and I heard a voice, an inner voice, say very strongly, "Don't turn over." And then like a second later, John just came flying out in a true, I think, fetus ejection reflex that Michelle O'Donnell talks about. I'd say my body gave maybe 3 or 4 semi-involuntary pushes. And then when I was on the toilet. And then as soon as I got to the bed, then he just flew out. And my husband reached out and caught him in midair. And I just heard him say, "It's a boy." And because we had thought it was a girl. So we had been calling him Elizabeth all during the pregnancy. So
that's funny. I bet he still would respond subconsciously to that.
Right. So, and so, and then about maybe 45 minutes later or so, I got up, and delivered the placenta, I think, into the toilet. And then they just scooped it up and took it out to the woods. And
I love the involvement of the men, because obviously, society really socializes men to be very grossed out by this stuff and to be very timid around birth. And I loved reading that line in your book that one of the men, and you never name them, you just call them the men. It's like one of the men, scoops up my afterbirth and took it outside. And I could totally picture this. I could totally picture your birth just with this group of, totally engaged men who were supporting you and so curious about it, and probably really experiencing it as this very mammalian, event, like a National Geographic, show, that wasn't gross at all. It was just so amazing and interesting and new. And I
think it probably was it had a real impact on all of them.
How could it not? Of course.
Right. And I remember I spoke at a birth conference once, and a man came up to me and he said, "You had 5 men at your birth. That's perverted."
What?
That's perverted.
Oh, get off.
But none of them were there because they had any, it wasn't like a sexual thing.
Of course.
At all, So, so anyhow, so that was my first birth, and it was just, such a great experience. And so
and then we get into the just horrible story of the Child Protective Services.
Right.
And I did want to touch on that because, so many women that free birth intersect with CPS, whether it's, a very common story that I'm hearing is they birth at home and then they get nervous that they have a retained placenta. And so they go to the hospital for help. Or another common one is they just want to go to the hospital and have baby checked out.
Right.
And then before they know it, they're admitted and CPS is questioning them.
Right.
So,
and I think it's kind of, I see it in people they're sort of on the fence. like they want an unassisted birth, but they're not sure if they're sort of there, sort of not, and they want it. The baby's born, everything went well, maybe, and but they want to, maybe I better get the baby checked out just to make sure.
Well, and the error, and this is so unfortunate, but the error that they're making is they are thinking the hospital is their ally.
Right.
And obviously, ideally, we'd all be living in a world where we could birth however we want and use the medical model to assist us, but that is not the deal.
Right. And I think, people, unassisted birth is legal, but a lot of people don't know that. So, and a lot of people who are in social services don't know that. And, what I do hear is when people are hassled by social services, it's like 99.9% of the time, like it blows over, like everything is okay, but it's still difficult to go through.
It's horrifying.
It's like, yes.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I've talked to quite a few women now who have CPS show up at their door, or, in your experience, it sounded like your baby was actually removed from you for a week or more?
Yeah, for 5 days.
Oh.
Now, in my case, my mother had called social services during my pregnancy, and
thanks, Mom.
She wanted to, I know her motivation was good. She wasn't really trying to report me. She wanted a nurse to come over and kind of help me. That's what she wanted. She wanted a nurse, somebody that I could call if I needed to, or somebody that could counsel me. And, I'm a doctor's daughter. I don't know. Somebody shows up at my door and says, I'm a visiting nurse and I'm here to help. I know nothing about social services. That whole world is just so foreign to me. So when this woman comes over and says, and she's with a social worker, we're just here, like, if you need anything. They didn't come in and say, like, you can't do this or this is illegal, of course, because it wasn't. But they didn't really try to discourage me from doing it. They kind of came in as, we are your friends and we're here to help you and tell us about yourself. And so they kind of wanted us to sort of open up to them, and which we did. And we thought, we told them all about why we were doing this. And, we were happy to share it with these people that seemed interested. And after the baby was born, I called them. I said, we had the baby, come on over. So the nurse came over with the social worker. And what I didn't know, I didn't know about breastfeeding. My husband had actually wanted me to go to La Leche League when I was pregnant. But everybody that I was telling that I was going to have this unassisted birth, and I don't even know if we were calling it unassisted birth because I wasn't familiar, I didn't know the term until my publisher years later titled my book Unassisted Childbirth. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess that's what I did. But, but I did tell people, we're just going to do it ourselves. And people were horrified. So I became very isolated during my pregnancy.
I bet.
And I actually didn't tell my parents I was pregnant until I was 7 months pregnant. So they saw me when I was 6 months pregnant and said, it's too bad you gained all this weight, because I had always been heavy, and then I lost weight before I got pregnant. And so my mom said,
why did you withhold that information?
Why didn't I tell them? I figured they would be horrified. I'm a 20-year-old college student. I've met this guy. He's 10 years older than I am. We've decided we're going to have a baby without a doctor or midwife there. And I'm like, I'm going to hold off on telling them as long as possible. And so I saw them at 6 months, and they didn't know I was pregnant. And then at 7 months, I was supposed to go to my sister's wedding, and I didn't go. And my mom figured it out. I told my sister, or maybe my sister, I said, I can't come, Sue. I put on weight. I don't feel good about myself. And then suddenly she's like, oh my God, you're pregnant. And then, so my mom found out at my sister's wedding.
Oh my gosh.
I wasn't there. So anyhow, they had called. So I didn't know about breastfeeding. I'd never seen anyone breastfeeding, and I didn't realize that John wasn't getting a good grip on me. He just was like sucking on the tip of my nipple. And I didn't know. And so the visiting nurse, and my mother, I think, had brought up a scale, and the visiting nurse and the social worker, they said, and maybe my mother, I don't know, they said they felt like he was losing too much weight. Well, I had read that babies lose weight, in the first few days. And so I said, no, he's fine. And so the visiting nurse and social worker said, we want you to take the baby to a doctor. And we said no. And so they came back with 3 police and they took him away. And so they took him to the hospital and they said he's now in the property. He's now the property of Boulder County Social Services.
And, that situation does bring up an interesting point, because if your baby was truly dehydrated and not breastfeeding well, and you didn't have the tools, support, education, whatever to identify that, not that I think it's ever appropriate to take the child away, but,
right.
Of course there needs to be a better system in place. Like a lactation consultant could have been paired to you. I mean,
right.
There's plenty of things
right.
that should have happened, never, ever
right.
to cause the trauma of separation. But it does bring up, that interesting kind of devil's advocate of, it is ultimately their job to make sure that the baby is safe and well. And in this particular situation, the baby did, it sounds like need to be doing better.
Right.
What do you think of that?
I mean, I think, they, at that point, I needed help. And yes, it would have been great if somebody would have said, okay, you're not, you're nursing him properly. And the nurse she wrote down nursing him properly. And I said to her later, why didn't you tell me? And she said, I didn't think you would listen.
Right.
And I don't know, it's like, I look at, okay, I had my own reasons for creating that whole event. It sort of got me to take a stand. And I basically had to decide, okay, how am I going to live my life? I mean, when they now have my baby, and I better start believing in myself, or I'm not going to, I'm going to lose my child. And that's how I felt. I wasn't like, okay, now I'm going to do what they say. They
Sure.
have my child and now I'm going to do what they say. For me, it was, I better start believing in myself. But I also felt like I didn't really want to look at the medical profession as my enemy, which I see some people doing. And I don't, yes, I am critical of the medical profession in my book, but I really don't go after them in a way that I've seen some people do. And I think I try to be understanding, like most of these people are well-meaning. I just think they're misguided. And so,
totally,
I'm not out to like reform the medical community. I feel like I'm out to encourage people to remove themselves from it as much as possible, because to me, birth is not a medical event.
Right. And use it when there's something actually wrong, because in every other situation, why do you go to the hospital? Because something is wrong. Right. But not when something is well. You don't just like go there to have them check out your heart when there's nothing going on.
Right.
That is weird. That's a waste of time. But when something's up, we're so grateful that model exists for kind of the limited scope of what they can really do.
Right. And so I think, after that, I felt like, they took him, they put him in the hospital. They said he was dehydrated. They gave him fluids, and a nurse worked with me for like half an hour. And she's like, he's not getting a good grip on your nipple, and here is how it should be. And suddenly John latched on, and that was it. And I never had a problem again.
Nice.
And it's like, it was so simple, but I think it was just one of these things that it was this big drama that sort of had to play out. I wrote in my book about a dream I had after they took John, the night that they took him, and that I dreamt that I was, that my father was there, or maybe I was in the hospital, I don't know. And my father said, these are my rules and you are going to live by them. Now sign this. And I signed it.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, there was a part of me that was really afraid to take that step and say, I'm going to give birth the way I want to give birth. And I think, the thing is that when people sort of give in and they say, you know what, well, my mother's too scared, my friends are all afraid, and so I think I'm just going to go ahead and have the kind of birth that they want. I'm going to go ahead this time, and I'm going to do it in the hospital. The birth is only the first challenge, because then you're going to deal with people
everything.
Who don't think, it's like sooner or later, there are going to be people that don't think you should do long-term breastfeeding.
Exactly. Where does vaccine or circumcise?
Right.
Where does the line?
Right.
At what point are you going to start making decisions about your parenting?
Right, and absolutely. And I feel like that's why I felt like I put myself in a position where, and I was ready to go to the hospital and steal him. I know, I read that. To the hospital. I took this little gym bag, and I'm like,
oh my God.
If it looks like I'm not going to get him back, because they were talking about putting him in a foster home, I'm like, I'm stealing him, and we're going on the lam.
Well, and that really speaks to, the desperation of a mother who, is forced to be separated from their child, and that, obviously, objectively, that would get you in so much more trouble, and probably actually cement the fact that you're not like a suitable parent, and then you'd lose your kid for real. But in the moment, all that matters is that primal mama bear, I will do anything to get my young back. And, and we see this, like with incarcerated women, a very common story of why incarcerated pregnant women are incarcerated is they do a last-ditch effort to steal money for diapers, or to steal money, or to return to the streets if they're prostituting, some sort of final desperate attempt so that they can scrape some money together before the baby comes. And it gives I think more context to hear you say that, because you're not a woman of the street, and that to hear that you were bringing a gym bag to literally steal your baby bag. I mean, it's not funny. It's actually incredibly sad.
But I mean, we might as well laugh about it now.
Yeah, exactly. It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And thankfully you didn't have to do that. And thankfully, you received your child back quite quickly. But, yeah, it's wild.
So we did get him back after 5 days. They gave him back. They said they wanted to continue to counsel us, which we were like, fine, great, whatever.
Yeah, whatever.
And then, but eventually they started getting very nosy, but we still had to go to court when he was 5 months old.
Ugh.
And so, but actually, they went so overboard when they went to court to try to show how insane we are. They brought in a psychiatrist that said we were insane.
Wow.
And we had never met the psychiatrist.
Ugh.
And the whole thing, they went so overboard that the judge threw it out of court.
Thank
God. I was never bothered again.
That's what I was going to ask you, because then you went on to have, many more unassisted births. And did CPS ever knock on your door again?
Never.
Oh,
never.
Thank gosh.
And as you know, we lost a baby.
Mm-hmm.
So even when we lost the baby, he had a congenital heart defect and died within a few hours of his birth. Even then, social services never came over, and I sought them out. I mean, not social services. I did contact the coroner because someone had said to me, "Oh, are they going to put you in jail now?" And I was like, "Oh my God, or am I going to be blamed for this baby's death?" And I contacted the coroner, and he said, "This baby just never developed the body to survive, and it wasn't your fault. He wouldn't have lived regardless of where he would have been born." And I put all that in my book, and it's you look on the internet, and people are slamming me. It's like, here, you want a reason to discount everything that Laura Shanley says? Here it is.
Really?
She lost a baby, and it's like, yes, babies sometimes die.
And like you said, you then, this happens, that you then went on to know a woman who had a similar situation, who birthed in the hospital, and that child passed as well. But, you can bet your butt she didn't get any crap for the way that she did it.
Now, that was my aunt, my father's sister, and it actually wasn't that far before I had my baby, but she had a baby with a congenital heart defect in the hospital, and that baby ended up dying. And of course, there was never anything said, but with me, people feel it's fair game,
And it's so interesting because it really speaks to this very confused stance that people have where, like, let's say Republicans who want to have, power, autonomy and get the government out of your business and all of this stuff, but they also feel like they have the right to speak on the behalf of your fetus and to make these decisions for some woman they've never met. But it's this interesting, very confused, blurry line of, there's this like presentation that we should get to do what we want and have autonomy, which Republicans fundamentally, believe, and that the government should stay out of their, personal life choices. And then also, and especially, very religious people. But then if you make what I would call your birth and many free births, women that I'm talking to make deeply spiritual choices to really surrender and sit with what God has to offer, in their birth and what your child's journey is. And if you do that outside the medical model, you're considered a kook when really you're doing the exact thing that they're actually fighting for.
Right.
It's just so interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it brings up so many issues. And I think, and what I don't really identify as Republican or Democrat.
Me either.
I'm sort of more an independent, but I do think it's interesting that when home birth legislation comes up, it's usually supported by Republicans, and that reproductive rights, you have Democrats supporting reproductive rights up until the point of birth. Mm-hmm. But there are many people who will say, yes, you should have the right to have an abortion. No, you should not have the right to have an unassisted birth. Mm-hmm. So it's
so weird.
It can be frustrating.
Totally. But it's very frustrating.
But I think, it is. It's my body. And, this is how I'm choosing to have my children. And I believe I have every right to give birth. And is there one way of birth that's going to ensure that a baby never dies? No.
Of course not.
There just isn't.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And, what would happen to this patriarchal system if we actually trusted women as adult mothers, to make intuitive decisions. Something that I'm always going back to is, one of my biggest triggers with the obstetrical model and the midwifery model many times. One of my biggest issues is that anybody thinks that they can act like they care more about the wellness and health and survival of somebody else's child, and just how totally degrading and disrespectful that is to the mother, and completely wrong.
Right.
Because I have personally never met a woman who doesn't care 1,000 times more about their birth, their body, their baby's, health, etc. And it's a very polarizing, concept that's incredibly disempowering to act like we already mentioned, to act like they know better, and but until you go home, and then once you go home, you have to deal with this baby. You have not been empowered to, take care of.
Right.
Yeah, it's really a trip. So let's keep moving on through your birth. Okay. So then we come to, I believe was the foot falling out of your body.
Right. So, I kind of feel like I have this sort of, been there, done that.
Totally.
Like I've had all these experiences, like, okay, phase presentation, footling, breech, baby being taken away, baby dying, like, so that
the whole thing.
People could say, like, well, what about this? I'm like, been there, done that, like, I don't know, but I did not have textbook births. So, but yeah, my second one, I was planning on giving birth on my hands and knees because that's how John was born. And I was like, that worked so well. And then I had a dream. And as I say in my book, I don't believe every dream is prophetic, or, sometimes dreams are symbolic. But every so often I have a dream that I feel like is presenting me with a valid message. Well, they all present us with messages, but it's just how we interpret them, So this one I felt was literal. I was watching a woman giving birth. She was catching the baby herself, and she was standing up over a little plastic baby bathtub. And I heard a voice in the dream say, tell her to remember not to do too much. And I thought, oh, I understand what the voice is saying. It's it's a matter of sort of just getting out of the way and not doing anything, which is pretty much what I did with John. But so I decided then, okay, I'm going to just get out my little plastic baby bathtub and I'm going to stand over it like I saw the woman. And so I did have a friend who, I think it was one of the men who was at my first birth. He had a dream that he saw the baby inside me standing right side up. But I didn't necessarily see that as, then I'm going to have a footling breech baby. But so I didn't know it was going to be feet first. I just knew that I wanted to be standing and that I was going to do nothing to interfere. So I went into labor with him one morning about 7:30, started feeling contractions. We actually had sex in labor with him, and I hadn't read anything about, the benefits of having sex in labor at that time. But, and then I got up and I was walking across the room. I thought, well, I'll take a shower. And I was walking across the room and my water broke. And after my water broke, I didn't feel any pain at all. It was like the only way I even knew I was having contractions was to put my hand up inside myself. I could feel my muscles contracting.
Wow.
So because with John, I felt some pain, and I also felt some pain when John came out, because face presentation is not the easiest,
Absolutely.
So,
And I've only seen a couple of them, but they're, I mean, I guess if it's your only point of reference, who knows if you just, you're just over there thinking it's normal versus if you had a team of people with worried looks and talking about this face presentation and it might need to be a C-section. I mean, gosh, you probably would have felt a lot more pain. So with that second birth, did you, when you were saying that, that you didn't feel the contractions, I mean, other than going up inside, couldn't you tell externally that they were happening or not at all?
As far as did my belly look like it was
like, did you really not feel them?
Oh, I really didn't. After my water broke, I was not feeling them.
That's amazing.
So, or I was not feeling pain. Now, maybe I seem to remember that I just wasn't, I don't know, they weren't painful. So if I felt any contractions, I would assume I just wasn't feeling them, because I don't know how you would, I wasn't feeling pleasurable contractions, the way like with an orgasm, I wasn't feeling pleasurable contractions.
Sure.
So I do remember I just didn't feel anything. And
plus with the breech, you get a little bit of, it's a little easier without having that head at the bottom.
Right. There's no head pressing on there. So I just remember feeling up inside and like, my muscles are contracting. So I'm just kind of going about my life. And, but I took out, because with my first birth, he was born right after my water broke. And so I figured, okay, my water has just broken. I assume a baby's coming soon. So I'm standing there, and that's when a foot comes out. And so David looked at me. He's like, what do you want to do? Like, do you want to go to the hospital? And I just said, no. The thought of going to the hospital was so terrifying to me. And I just felt like, no, I'm a big believer in belief suggestions, affirmations. So we just said affirmations, that I'm relaxed. I trust my body. I love myself. I believe in myself. I believe I have inner help. And because I'm not in any pain, it's like, it's kind of easy to just stand there with this foot hanging out of you, if you don't panic. And he was wiggling his toes and, flexing his foot. And I just remember my 2-year-old John saying, what's that?
Yeah, that's a trip.
And I said, that's the baby. And then his foot just kept getting lower and lower. And then at some point his other foot popped out. And then something inside me just said the time was right. And I gave one push-pull. And I've heard people say, I remember reading a story about a woman who had a footling breech, and she was telling the midwife, I feel like I need to pull. And the midwife is saying, no, do not pull on the baby. Well, and the baby ended up dying in that case. And in my case, I felt like pulling, and it wasn't a strong pull. It was just a kind of one push pull. and whatever pressure I was exerting, it was very gentle, but this is what my inner self was telling me to do.
Sure.
And I just sort of pulled him out. And that was 2 hours after I felt my first contraction.
Amazing.
So, and you know, I didn't, with my first birth, I had some after pains. I didn't have them with the other ones. So, and I was just so elated.
I bet. That's
and
incredible.
When I wrote about it, you know, I asked David about it like 12 years later when I was writing my book. I asked him something about that birth, and he's like, I don't know, I wasn't there. He's like, he said he was in the other room.
Well, it's making me think of, did you see the April the giraffe thing, birth?
I didn't. I still need to see that.
Yeah. So one of the things I loved about it, you know, it was an unassisted birth, you know, minus a million people watching, but you know, they didn't, right. Minus that whole observation piece, nobody touched the giraffe. She was by herself in her like pen or whatever, but it was a footling breech. And so the baby, right. Her leg hung out of her for quite some time, like an hour or something, a very long time.
Wow.
And I totally got that image when you were explaining the birth of your second, because it was this foot that kind of would move around, and it would just kind of, you'd see more and more and more of it. And then eventually the other leg came out, and it was, I'm totally picturing the similarities.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And with my birth story, maybe I should put a picture of her. Like, well, this is pretty much how I look,
exactly. You got to watch it. Yeah. It's, and it's, it's, the reason it's cool is because it's just a normal birth, right? And it's the same thing with all of these free birth stories that I love. You know, so far, most unassisted birth stories are pretty simple. You know, they go into labor, they move around a little bit, they get some intuition, and a baby slides out. You know, it's not these complicated stories.
Right.
So then we're on to your third birth, which is that the one that you did alone again?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you just like walked over somewhere and brought the baby to David?
Yeah. Well, David and I had gotten into an argument during the birth.
Oh my gosh.
And so it was like the stupidest argument. And so, but
you had wanted, is it true that you had wanted to do it by yourself intentionally as a personal challenge?
Yeah, I just kind of thought, and this is how I felt with all my births, as far as not necessarily saying this is how it's going to be. Like, okay, I'm going to have my children there, or I'm not going to have my children there, or I'm going to do it myself, or I'm going to have my husband catch. I just kind of like, you know what, if I'm alone, I'll be okay.
Of course, yeah.
And if David's there, that's fine. So, but it had entered my mind that I felt like, I think if I'm alone, I'll be fine. And maybe that would be kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But I wasn't going to chase David away. And I did have a friend who lived next door, and she was like, if you want me to come over, that's fine. But, I went into labor with Joy, and because my other labors were pretty quick, and especially my second labor had been 2 hours. So I started feeling contractions with her, and I was like, okay, baby's coming. Well, 24 hours later, baby's still not coming. And so now eventually I realized she was posterior. So she was facing towards my front rather than
you really did get it all.
My back. Right.
Of course she was.
Yeah. But, and I'm kind of working with myself mentally, like, what the hell is taking so long?
And did you experience the traditional back labor pains, or how was the sensations for you?
I don't remember back labor. I remember pain. Mm-hmm. So I did have pain with her, whereas, Willie's birth, my second, had been so easy. And so I did have some pain with her, not pain like where, okay, I'm going to the hospital, but pain where I cried. He used to go over and study at the library on campus. And so that was his normal morning routine. And so he got up, I'm still in labor, and I hadn't been talking to him about the labor, really. I mean, I think he knew I was feeling some contractions, but he got up and he left. And he and it was like, as soon as he walked out, I was like, yes.
Oh, nice.
Like it was a relief to have him leave. So,
because of the
and at
tension.
that point, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, brilliant man, lots of problems. Very thankful he turned me on to this, but no, we're not together anymore. So,
okay.
Yeah. So as soon as he left, the contractions picked up, and I took a shower, and but I was crying in the shower, and then I took out my little baby bathtub, and as I wrote in my book, then the phone rang. And I answered it, and it was, I was running a donut delivery service that I had started, and I was running that out of my home. And so it was the lady at the University of Colorado calling to give me my donut order. And I was
love
like,
that you answered the phone.
Yeah. And she's like, I was like very dedicated to my business. And I was like, I'm in labor. I can't take this now. And she's panicking because she's like, who am I going to give this donut order to? And
you're
I don't
like, priorities,
really
woman.
Realized, right. I don't think she realized, she's probably envisioning me at the hospital and, with my epidural or something. And, why can't I just take her order? So
you mean that you don't think she was envisioning you being alone, unassisted with other kids?
Right.
Answering the phone.
Right. And so, it did kind of add some levity to the situation. Like, I'm just like, I can't, I'll call you back later. And so I hung up, and my kids were sleeping. So I just took out the little bathtub, and then Joy started coming out, and my water hadn't broken. So I looked down, and I saw her face looking up at me through the water bag.
Wow.
So I could just see this film, just looking at her eyes. And it was like really just such a spectacular moment. I really feel like it was sort of the most spectacular moment of my life.
Yeah.
Just because I felt such a connection to her. I remember feeling like we were the only two people in the world. And I remember feeling like this is the most wonderful gift I've ever received. And so we just looked at each other through the water bag, and then it popped, and she slid out into my hands. And I just was, I was elated. I just put her down in the baby bath. I had a little bouncy chair, and I put her in the bouncy chair. I think I wrapped her up, put her in the bouncy chair. And I think, the placenta came out, I don't know, maybe within 15 minutes or something. I birthed that into the bathtub. And then I went and lay down on the couch, and I just started hearing like ocean waves and bells, and I just was blissed out. Yeah. I was so blissed out, and I didn't have after pains with her either. And then the boys woke up, and I remember John made me a glass of chocolate milk. He was 4.
So cute.
And then I said, let's go find David, because we knew he was over on campus and that he might be having breakfast at the cafeteria there. And so I just was, I wasn't in pain, and it had been, the actual birth had been pretty quick. Like the labor was long, but it wasn't like I was sore or anything from, with any of my births, there was never this pushing. I'm pushing for an hour or whatever,
And there's something, obviously to be said of, because you were alone, you had no other energies to contend with, even on a psychic level. You got to you got to experience what 100% presence and companionship with this little girl being born, where there was nothing else, no eyes on you, no voices. Even just your energetic body didn't have to organize anybody else's energy. And so it doesn't surprise me that you then got to look down and have this eye contact and feel like you were the only two in the world, because that is true, undisturbed birth.
Right. To have that connection. I felt like I said, I feel like I touched the eternal. That's how it felt. I touched the eternal. And even if I never have that kind of experience again, which I don't know if I've ever really had that kind of experience, but it's like, okay, once in my life, I had that kind of experience of feeling total connection with another human being. Yeah. And it was just spectacular, So, I mean, it forever changed me.
Yeah.
And even though, all of my births, I think, changed me. And I do remember feeling elated, with my other births, but especially with that one, I think just because, and it was such a contrast to, everything that had been going on before, and the fighting and the tension, and then just like immediate relief and total connection and triumph, feelings of triumph. And so we, then after a little while, I lay down for a little while, and then I said, okay, let's get dressed. And we got dressed, and I had this little white wicker doll carriage and that my mother-in-law had given me. And so we put Joy in the doll carriage, and it was November 17th. This was 1982. But the temperature was in the 70s. And, this was in Boulder, Colorado. And we just walked over to the campus, and I just felt like I'm floating on air. He had come home. After we left, somehow we missed him. We walked over there, and he had come home, and he saw the placenta in the bathtub.
Okay.
And so then he went back over to the campus, and we were having breakfast. We just went ahead and we were having breakfast there with his friends, and then he assumed that's where I probably
of course,
was.
Yeah.
And so, and then he sat down and had breakfast with us.
Nothing like coming home looking for your family and just finding a placenta in the bathtub.
Right. And it's like, I think somebody asked him at one point, well, you saw the placenta. Did it occur to you that maybe something had gone wrong or she was in the hospital? He's like, no.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we were so confident then, and I mean, and now I guess, life, 40 years of life, I've certainly had my struggles. So maybe in some areas I'm not as confident, but back then I was like, he was like, of course everything went fine.
Absolutely. So. And I mean, I'm sure that your confidence in your birth experiences, how do I say this? I think that it gets painted a lot that, if you're free birthing, you're just like a fearless, totally confident person in the world, and not necessarily at all, but it is one thing that, you're willing to be courageous in, and it's one pillar of your life. And that doesn't mean that there aren't struggles in other areas, but it is, thankfully it is something that you have in your reference point, that you can say, I did this, I trusted myself. And I'm sure that influences other aspects of your life.
Absolutely. I mean, my mother has said to me how surprised she was that I have done this, because she said I was always such a timid child. And, they would make fun of me that we'd go jeeping, and I walked behind the Jeep. I was so scared. Or we'd go sailing. We had a sailboat with a cabin, and I'd be down in the cabin crying, and the boat would be leaning, and they would go skiing, and my family was always very physical. And I was just always so terrified. And so this was like not in keeping with my personality at all. But it just always felt so right to me. And it gave me a tremendous amount of confidence in myself.
Yeah. And it's internal strength versus like, hope the Jeep doesn't tip over. You know? That's a little more external. I mean, I can see how that's different. And so then... And then, I thought the story of your fourth birth and fourth experience was so powerful and so interesting. And, while I'm not, this is the story of the baby that you lost. And while I'm not surprised that you've gotten, backlash because the internet is cruel, I really, really resonated with what little you did share of the birth. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah. Well, I got pregnant with him, and I was using mental birth control.
What does that mean, by the way? I wanted to ask you. Does that just mean, were you using fertility awareness at all, or were you just...
No, I was
just going, like, I will not get pregnant.
That's right.
Awesome.
And I know people who have successfully done that. And, but I think my desire to have babies was so strong that it sort of overrode my desire not to have babies.
Well, and it worked most of the time, right?
Yeah. So I got pregnant with him, and I was, I had a husband that had emotional problems. I was the breadwinner. I was pretty much the breadwinner for the entire length, since my husband, he broke his ankle when John was a couple months old, when my first baby was a couple months old, and he never went back to work. He was sort of a scholar. He read books, and he's the one that, got me into all this, but he taught me a lot, but he never was really able to go out there and deal with the world. And so I was always the breadwinner. And so here I am, I've created this donut delivery service that is successful, but I've got 3 kids, and we also had decided we were going to homeschool, but I was doing the homeschooling, and it was just very tough. And so when I got pregnant with my 4th child, I really felt like, okay, I'm allowing this baby to leave. I said belief suggestions. I'm letting go of the baby. It's okay. Now is not the time to have another baby. Financially, it's just too stressful. I can't deal with this. And I didn't miscarry. And so I didn't feel comfortable at that time having an abortion. And I was terrified of having an abortion. And so I just figured, okay, I'll make the best of it. And then one night when I think I was around 8 months pregnant, and I'm not exactly sure, I never really, I was nursing I nursed straight for like 11 years. So I never really knew when I got pregnant with any of my kids, other than my first. I knew the night that I got pregnant because, as I talk about in my book, I had a very vivid dream about it. And John actually was born on his due date. It's like November 30th, I had the dream, and August 21st was his due date, and bam, he was there. The other ones I never really knew. So, but I felt like I was maybe 8 months. But I had a dream that I saw a woman giving birth, and she caught the baby herself, and someone said she finally let go of the baby. And in the morning, I went into labor, and he was born. It was a short labor. I took a bath, and then I stood up. He wasn't born in the bath water, but my water broke, and there was meconium in the water, which had never happened before. And then he came out, and he wasn't breathing. And I breathed into him and got him going. And then, but a couple hours later, he died. He had it looked to me like the bones in his chest were kind of sticking out a little bit. I've since read that actually is not that uncommon, that it goes away on its own. But but I don't know. I felt like, once I breathed into him, I thought, okay, he's fine. And
did something feel like off to you at all during the pregnancy, once you accepted the pregnancy, and or even during the birth? Was there ever a intuitive flag or?
No. Just that, I was very stressed, and I felt like this is, I'm now feeling the pressure of I'm already taking care of a family of 5, and I'm 20, I can't remember whether I was 27 years old. I think I was 27 years old. And so, but I got him dressed, and David had been gone. I think he came home, and then I thought John was sleeping. Not John, Nicholas was sleeping. And I went to change his diaper, I think. And then David looked at him. He's like, is he dead? He wasn't moving. And he actually had like a little bit of a smile on his face. And the baby did, and I kind of, shook him a little bit, and we realized, okay, I think he's gone. And we called the paramedics, and they came out, and they tried to revive him, and they took him to the hospital, and they couldn't revive him. And the people at the hospital were all very nice to me, and they just said he had, when the autopsy came back, they said he had a congenital heart defect, influenza, pneumonia, and sepsis.
Oh my gosh.
And they said, and that's basically probably why I gave birth to him early.
Totally.
It was sort of a spontaneous miscarriage. It's just that I was fairly far along. And I really, to this day, I can't really say how far along I was exactly. But
were you transparent with the hospital about your unassisted birth and no prenatal care?
Yeah, no, I mean, I never tried to hide anything. And no one ever, I mean, I just was treated so kindly, and people were so, we called the ambulance, the ambulance people. I mean, eventually I got bills, from the hospital
Yeah.
and from the ambulance company. The ambulance company dropped the charges. The hospital turned me over to a collection agency. So they weren't quite as understanding.
Yeah.
But the coroner, as I said, I had called, and he just, no one, they really felt that nothing, they didn't feel anything could have been done.
Mm-hmm.
So, and actually police came right after, when, after they came and took him to the hospital, then police came over. And what's interesting is that I'd given birth in the bathtub, and after they took the baby, and then I cleaned the bathtub. I think it wasn't after they took the baby. It was after I'd given birth, and he was, just lying in the baby chair. I was like, you know what? I'm going to clean out the bathtub. So I think, when police came over, and maybe they're expecting this bloody scene,
right,
and they see this pristine bathtub. But, I never was hassled. And
thank God.
And really, I think that if I never would have, I mean, we didn't really know many people in those days. And I think if I never would have written about this birth, I don't think anybody would have ever said anything, when I wrote my book. And I've thought about that. I thought I'm giving people a hammer to hit me over the head with,
Oh, exactly. And it took, and I was thinking that as I was reading it. I mean, I personally completely resonate with the way you framed it, and it hasn't happened to me, but I do feel like I would feel similarly around the spiritual side of it, of how you spoke of it, but it does take a lot of courage to put that out there with the rawness and the honesty that you did. I mean, to acknowledge that you did pray for a miscarriage and had a lot of reservations around having this child, and and
eventually when I wrote about it, I wrote about it initially on the internet and in my book, and then I had said something about the bones in his chest were malformed, and then when I read more about maybe they really weren't malformed, and I had written that he was I think he was a month early, and then I felt like, well, you know what? I really can't say for sure that he was a month early because I really don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I rewrote the story. And now if you can read about me on the internet about how I changed my story. And obviously I must have changed my story because I'm hiding something. No, I changed my story because I felt like I really can't say for sure that I was 8 months pregnant.
Yeah.
I really can't say that the bones
it's your
were
story.
malformed
You're allowed to.
It's read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so,
this brings up a question I was wondering about. I know that legally, like you said, you're allowed to legally have a free birth in your home. But what about an unassisted pregnancy? Is that completely legal in all 50 states?
I have read that in Nebraska, I read years ago that it is illegal. It's a misdemeanor for a father to catch a baby in a non-emergency situation. It doesn't say anything about the mother. Now, I haven't heard of that law being enforced. There are now some states that say if you want to get a birth certificate, you are required to take the baby, or maybe even if you don't, you're required to take the baby to a doctor within the first 24 hours. And as far as prenatal care, I really don't know whether.
Yeah, I wonder. I got to look into that.
I haven't heard that that there's any sort of a law saying you have to have prenatal care. And even with the birth, it's I mean, people talk about, well, you can always say oops, like even if they said unassisted birth is illegal, how can anyone prove that? Of course, if you haven't gotten prenatal care, then they might deduce that, well, you really did want to have this baby unassisted. Mm-hmm. But, basically I feel like if if you can have confidence in yourself and you believe that what you're doing is your right, that you don't have to be afraid of social services. It's like, I went up against social services and I won. And I don't feel like that was an accident. I feel like my intention I do feel like I created that situation basically because I was sort of on the fence, and it sort of forced me to take a stand and believe in myself. But I think the same confidence that you have about the birth, you need to have regarding
your baby.
Services.
Yeah.
And just saying, you know what, nobody is going to force me to give birth in a way that I don't want to. Other people are not that powerful, that I am powerful, and I can create the birth that I want, and I can create the life that I want. And the authorities are not as powerful as some people think. And I think, that's why I'm still such a believer in the power of our minds, that you need to envision that you are safe. You need to believe that you are safe.
Hey listeners, if you're liking what you're hearing, leave me a review on iTunes. It helps this podcast get seen by more potential listeners. Let's get these stories and this important information out there. Now back to the show. Okay, so then we have your last baby, your final daughter. How did that birth go?
Well, that one was also very easy and probably most straightforward. Just started feeling contractions with her early in the morning, and I had decided not to say anything to David, like I was in labor. I just felt like I'm going to hang out here and just relax. And so I just lay in bed and I said my belief suggestions, and I actually sort of fell asleep. And then I woke up and I felt like I told myself I'm moving out of the way and allowing this to happen. And I just really sort of felt myself psychologically step aside, which I think I did to a degree with all of my births. But I somehow, I don't know, I felt myself able to do it. I was just really breathing deeply and just lying there. And I just said, I'm not fighting this in any way. And then I decided to get up and take a bath. And David was up on the couch reading the paper. And so he saw me walk across the hall, and he said, "You taking a bath?" I said, "Yeah." I think I turned on the bath water. And then I sat down on the toilet and looked between my legs, and there was the water bag.
Oh my gosh.
And then it popped, and I stood up and caught her. And with her, she started coming out, and I saw the cord was wrapped around her neck, which I'd never had. And I've read that, maybe 25% of the time the cord's around the neck. Gloria LeMay, do you know who she is? Mm-hmm. She has said she's sort of a midwife. I don't know. Maybe she calls herself a traditional birth attendant these days. But she has written a lot of wonderful things. But she has said that it's the smart baby that keeps the cord around their neck because it keeps it out of the way. Mm-hmm. And so, but it's one of those things that people panic. Oh my
yeah.
God.
Well, there's there's a lot of lies about it in the mainstream. Right.
Mm-hmm. And it wasn't tight around her neck, but I did notice it was around her neck, and I lifted it off, and then she just slid into my hands, and the bathwater was still running, and I said, "David, will you come here?" And
I got a surprise
came down the hall. Yeah. And he saw me sitting there with this newborn, and he was like, his jaw just dropped, and I said, "Turn off the bathwater." And that was it. And I mean, it really was kind of just like going to the bathroom, as far as like, there was none of this pushing, it was like as easy as it gets. And some friends of mine had scheduled a baby shower for me for that day, because I thought I was going to be due like maybe around the middle of April, and this was April 5th. And so, basically we just cut the cord we didn't tie the cord with this one for some reason. I don't really remember our rationale, but, and I have read that some midwives believe that tying the cord off can trap bacteria in there. I don't know. I've tied it off, and then this time we didn't. And either way, we never had any problems with the umbilical cord. But the placenta came out, within 15 minutes or so, and, once again into the toilet. And I just nursed her, and we got dressed, and we went to the baby shower. And so,
oh, that's so funny.
I had worked up until Friday night. I was cocktail waitress, and I had worked Friday night, and everybody at the place, knew how I had my babies, and everyone was like, don't have the baby here. I'm like, well, it could happen. But so I had worked my shift Friday night, and then she was born Sunday morning. And so it was the other girls at work that had the baby shower. So I took her to the baby shower, and, they're looking at me. I walk in with a baby, and they're like, no, that's not your baby. We just saw you. And they had actually wanted to, some of the women had wanted to come to the birth. And I said, you know what, I'm going to see how I feel.
Yeah.
And when I'm in labor, which is what I tell people, see how you feel, and see who is it going to be a comfort to have people there. And to me, it's just like, no, I absolutely knew when I went into labor. It's like, no, I don't even want to tell David I'm in labor. And so,
well, you also were very committed and self-trained at giving yourself the validation that you needed,
Right.
And I think that's, so much of why people think that they need somebody else there to validate their experience and remind them that it's normal and that they can do this. But if you're able and willing to connect to that within yourself, which is the real work, that you,
right.
Can have
right.
that, then the script gets, flipped a little bit, that actually other people become distracting versus,
right.
versus
That's
helpful.
exactly how I felt.
Totally.
I mean, I absolutely feel, and that's why to call it unassisted birth, it's like, I felt like there was something within me that was assisting me. I never felt like it was just me, my ego giving birth. I felt like I was definitely in touch with something much wiser that is within me, that is guiding me. The same thing that any animal tunes into. Like, how do these animals know?
That's what your next book needs to be. It'll be called Nature Assisted Birth or God Assisted Birth, right, or something like that.
It's like, yeah, it's just the more you feel that internal guidance, then I think the less you turn to authorities in any area of your life.
Absolutely.
And I am just so absolutely convinced that we have that inner guidance in every area of our life. I happen to be very good at tuning into it when I'm giving birth. I wouldn't say that I'm always so great at tuning into it.
Sure.
But definitely when I give birth, I feel that guidance. It's there. It's those when I've heard a voice, or I've had a dream, or I've had an impulse. There's no mistaking it. And I feel so confident that I have that I don't, I just don't look to doctors as, it's just,
you don't need
their knowledge it just pales in comparison. I mean, we have so much more within us. And I think we have all these internal resources, dreams, impulses, intuition, belief suggestions. These are all things that we have at our disposal so that we can create what we want. And so I never felt alone. I always felt that I had help. And, I never set out to like, okay, I'm going to, originally it was like, okay, David's going to catch the baby and David's going to catch our babies. And he really only witnessed our first birth. He never witnessed another birth. I mean, I basically, I caught all the other babies, and that certainly was not how I set it out. I didn't set out to do it that way. It's just that I went along with what felt right at the time, and I trusted those impulses.
So then what led you to know that you needed to write this book?
Well, I've always loved writing. And I pretty much from the time I started having my babies, I felt compelled to tell people. And as I'm really not into proselytizing. I really don't feel like I have to convince the world, or I certainly don't share my story the way that I used to. My births were such transformative experiences for me, and I felt like I am not unique. I remember talking to a woman once who was a yoga teacher who had very easy births, and I said, do you tell this to your students? And she said, no, because I feel that all of my yoga training and all of the work that I have done has allowed me to have these easy births. And I don't think that other people that didn't do all these things that I did could have those kinds of births. For me, I feel like I didn't do much at all other than kind of psychologically move out of the way. I eliminated external interference and internal interference. That's basically what I did.
Which is no really small thing.
That's true. But to me, it was like, if you can grasp the concept of what it means to do nothing, then, and that's how I felt. Like, I feel like if I did this, I feel like pretty much anybody can. Like, it's so much easier than people realize, but it is a matter of being able to, I'd say one of the biggest challenges is standing up to a society that thinks you are insane. That 100%. Is probably one of the biggest challenges, because if you are going to look to everybody else for your support, this is going to be pretty hard. But if you can say, I'm not afraid of other people. They don't have power in my life. I believe in myself. I believe I have inner help, and I can do this. Then I believe you can, So because they were such transformative experiences for me, I just felt like I remember feeling at one point, I have got to share this with the world. I have got to share this with the world. And so, I used to just tell people, I remember being on a bus and the bus driver, I had my infant. Oh, where'd you have your baby? Oh, I just did it by myself at home. And she's just like, her jaw drops, and I walk off the bus. I really was isolated for many years because people just thought we are crazy.
Yeah.
And even my parents, I was estranged from my family for 14 years because my family just felt like you're insane. And I think when I finally decided I wanted to write about it when I was pregnant with Joy. I started writing about it during my pregnancy. So that was my third child. And I finally was able to get a magazine, a spiritual magazine, to publish my article. And then one day a catalog came in the mail from, I don't know how they got my name, but a catalog came from a company, Bergen and Garvey, who published birth books. And they published Michelle O'Donnell's book, The Nature of Birth and Breastfeeding. And I started looking at some of the other books that they were publishing too, and that one was by a midwife. And I thought, you know what, these people are like leaning in this direction. And so I wrote to them, and I said, I sent them my one magazine article, and I said, I'm in the process of writing this book, and it's going to be an expansion of this magazine article. And they wrote back, yes, we're very interested. Send us as much completed material as possible.
Awesome.
And they were primarily an academic press. And although they had a trade division at that time. And so when I got that letter, and actually the mailman dropped it. My son, John, found the letter outside on our lawn.
Oh my gosh.
And he brought it in. And so I didn't have one thing on paper. So I just went in my room and I spent like 6 months, and I sent them a manuscript, and they published it. And I was so thrilled, that somebody wanted to publish my book. They weren't asking me for any money. I didn't, my royalties were incredibly low because it was an academic press. But what it did is it gave me a little bit of credibility.
Totally.
And so then, and then they wanted me to do an update in 2012, which I did. But then finally, I didn't have a book that was available really to the general public because they no longer had a trade division, and this was a $40 hardback. And so finally, a few years ago, I had to buy the rights to my book. I bought the paperback rights.
Oh my gosh.
They will not sell me they won't sell me the ebook rights, so I can't do an ebook. My book still sells. It's in over 600 libraries around the world because they're very good at marketing to libraries. So I'm glad that it's out there. But I bought the paperback rights, and I self-published the paperback last year.
Oh, okay.
and I updated it. And, but like if somebody wants to quote from my book, I can't give them permission.
Wow.
So it's kind of strange that I don't own the rights to my book.
And
but,
is this your one and done, or do you think there's another book in your future?
I don't know. I mean, I've thought about writing another book. I just kind of feel, well, my publisher came back to me in 2012 and they said, can you give us another 15,000 words? And I'm like, you know what? It was hard for me to come up with the initial 50,000 words back in 1994, which is what they wanted, because basically what I'm saying is don't interfere physically or psychologically and babies pop out.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's, to me,
so really
it's
you need to just be making t-shirts.
Right. Yeah. It's like, I had to struggle. What I did was I put a bunch of birth stories in the book because it's like I can sum up my philosophy pretty easily. And I don't think it's this incredibly, it's like, do you have to know everything that's happening physiologically in order for you to have sex? Do you have to know in order to have an orgasm? Do you have to know, or in order to digest your food, or in order to go to sleep, to go to the bathroom, any of these things, do you have to really know? No, you just have to not, with any natural bodily function, don't interfere physically or psychologically. Relax and let it happen. And so that's basically my message.
But if we grew up, believing that we needed a team of people in the bathroom every time we needed to have a bowel movement, there would be some serious unlearning that needs to be done, which is the part that I think you did such a good job of capturing in the first half of your book before the personal narratives, that you deliver it in such a simple way that's very to the point, very well researched, and it's very clear that what's happening is an unlearning, and a part of the unlearning is to understand the default obstetrical model. We have to look at that, and it does. It is annoying that it has to be so cerebral, for so many people, because as you're describing, and as I know as well, it's the opposite of that we actually have to bring into birth, is to not be in our head. And, but because we process through our heads and because we're so programmed as a culture to not trust this, it's like the pathway has to go through the brain first for not for everybody, but for lots of people.
Well, that's why Grantley Dickery appealed to me. That's why, because I was so cerebral in those days. I wasn't spiritual initially. I was an atheist growing up. And so when Grantley Dickery explained, okay, this is what happens when you trigger fight flight. You literally keep blood from flowing to the uterus, and babies get stuck and women have tremendous pain. And I'm like, that makes total sense to me. Just like your face gets white when you're afraid, you turn white as a ghost, because the blood and oxygen is going to your arms and legs so you can fight the danger or run from it. He says the uterus of a frightened woman in labor is literally white. It doesn't have the fuel it needs, and babies get stuck and women have pain. And it's like, just don't do that. Just don't trigger fight flight. And so that's, so that's what my book is about. How to not trigger fight flight,
Totally.
And if you don't trigger fight flight, then you can go to sleep and you can go to the bathroom and you can have sex and you can have babies. So and that's what it is. It's about unlearning all of that. And so, and that's why, like I said, I've just felt like, I know how transformative it was for me, and I feel compelled to share it. Now I feel like it's kind of been a rude awakening for me in a lot of ways, because when I wrote my book, I thought, and I'm going to go to these birth conferences and I'm going to meet Ina May, and people are and I was not expecting the rejection from the midwifery community that I have experienced. So that was really what shocked me, because I thought we're all on the same page. I thought we are all wanting what's best for women. And it didn't occur to me that, so, you don't see me speaking at conferences really very often.
Gosh, it's such a good point. I'm glad you brought that up, because I feel that in the doula community. It's interesting because, you and I are both speaking to, I mean, you're much more established in this, but we're both speaking to, hey, you don't need anybody else. And if that's, I guess it's kind of, from an egotistical standpoint, or a profit standpoint, it is not in their best interest to support the message that their care and their model is not as needed as is painted. Now, that's not to say they're not needed. Obviously, I think they're a wonderful gateway, you know, and I think, I mean, the women I've worked with in the past who have what I would call a medicalized midwife, you know, just for them to take their birth out of the hospital was a huge jump. And more power to them, you know, that's great wherever you're at in the journey. But I hear that, and I'm disappointed to not see you, you know, speaking at conferences as well, because I think that the conversation around unassisted childbirth is really the essence of what is normal physiological birth. And we're not having that conversation as a birth community enough, because it gets so political, and it gets so, you know, it's so confronting, and even birth advocates, you know, I still find don't want to discuss death and don't want to discuss, all this department from medical model.
It can get uncomfortable, but I think, you know, what I always tell people too is, like, I never set out, you know, I didn't name my book Unassisted Childbirth. My message at that time was not necessarily, oh, if you just remove other people, you'll do fine. My message was really about belief, and, you know, it was kind of like, by the way, there was no one else there. But, you know, and that's kind of what my publisher wanted me to run with. But my original message was, if you believe in your own abilities, you can have this wonderful birth, and, you know, that isn't traumatic. And so I still believe that, you know, you can have a great birth with a doctor or a midwife, but I think it is a challenge because of all the rules and regulations. And you can say, you know, here's my birth plan, and I'd like everybody to leave me alone, and then I'll let you know if I need your help. It's like, yeah, right. Well, that's, you know, legally, they just can't do that. You know, it's the midwives in Colorado. I mean, they're legally required to check dilation and heart tones and transfer a woman to the hospital if she's not in active labor within 12 hours of her water breaking. And so, you know, but I just try to share my story, and I think, but like you said, for some people, just having a baby is, you know, that in itself is a major challenge, and however they get that baby, you know, but then others are like, you know what, I've had C-sections, I don't want that again. And I had a vaginal birth, and I had it in the hospital, and I had my epidural, but God, I avoided another C-section. It's like, so everybody has to decide for themselves, you know, for
where
me,
their bar is.
Like, right. Like it's not like I had this goal of, I'm going to see if I can do it without anybody's help, and I'm going to prove to myself. No, it's just like, to me, it felt like this is the most natural and safest way for me to give birth, and I'm going to go with that. You know, I feel for anybody else to be telling me what to do, I felt that would make my birth less safe and less of a good experience for me and my baby. So.
Well, and, you know, I mean, I feel the exact same way, but it's always so interesting to me when women come to this without having real exposure to what birth is in the hospital or regulated midwifery models, you know, like, the reason I came to this is because I've seen hundreds of births, you know, of women being told what to do. And I've gotten, you know, the gift of really getting to see what it's like, so that I can choose to opt out with a really experienced, you know, perspective. But, you know, I'm talking to lots of women who are choosing free birth without that. And it blows my mind. And I find it very exciting, you know, that's, you don't necessarily have to have seen, you know, a ton of hospital births to know that you don't want it.
You had asked me if at the time that we decided to do this, if we were aware of what was going on in hospitals, and we were not. And I was not aware until I started writing my book and I started researching birth. And I remember, like, oh my God, this is what they're doing to women in hospitals. I was like, you know, I'm not going to the hospital because I don't think I need them. But I had no idea until I started researching.
How validating, huh?
Yeah, right.
Well, we are at time, so I want to wrap up here. But I've thoroughly enjoyed connecting with you, and it's so fun to, you know, talk to somebody who has really not only paved this path for yourself, but for a lot of other women too. And, you know, your book just does such a good job of laying it out in a really comprehensive way. Of course, the personal narratives are always so powerful to read, and your own personal story is so interesting. Like you said, you've kind of seen it all.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, thank you. It's a really inspiring book, and you're an
Emily.
inspiring woman, and just so grateful to have you on this episode.
Oh, thank you, and good luck with your podcast and all the work you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. That's it for today, everyone. Join us next week for another episode of the Free Birth Podcast. Thanks for joining us, and remember, your body, your choice. Lots of love.